The ferry doors stood open, breathing cold into the dock. That was the only word for it. Breathing. The rubber seals around the frame flexed in and out with a wet, patient rhythm, as if the vessel had lungs somewhere in its steel ribs. Inside, the passengers sat in two neat rows beneath dim yellow lights. Their clothes were wrong for the season. Wool coats in midsummer. Church shoes slick with black water. One little girl held a paper ticket in both hands and stared at me with my mother's eyes. Behind me, the harbor master kept shouting my name, but the dock had gone strange under my feet, stretched longer than it should have been. The terminal was too far away. The shore was too far away. There was only the boat and the water below it, flat as polished glass. Then the knock came from beneath the hull. Once, twice, a third time, harder, like a fist asking to be let through. Every passenger turned toward the sound at the same moment. Not one of them blinked. The girl in the front row smiled at me with lips that didn't move naturally and said in my mother's voice, "You were always supposed to come back." I stepped onto the threshold, and something under the water answered me by rising. 3 nights earlier. The first thing I did when I got to the ferry terminal was unlock the lower gate. I didn't make a ceremony of it. I didn't hesitate, and I didn't feel watched or chosen or marked by some family obligation older than I understood. If I had, maybe I would have left the key in the lock and driven back to the motel by the highway and called the realtor in the morning. Instead, I snapped the rusted padlock, shoved the metal door with my shoulder in and let the dark below the building breathe on me. At the time, I told myself it was practicality. The town had sent me a packet after my Uncle Rory died, a thin envelope with property transfer papers, a map of the shoreline, a tax warning, and a line item noting substructure access. I had arrived expecting a ruin I could list, gut, or sell for lumber salvage. I needed the money. That was the plainest truth in the whole thing. I had debts behind me, and not the romantic sort people confess in bars. Not gambling, not sharks, nothing cinematic, just accumulated failure, back rent, credit cards, a business that had gone under because I kept insisting things would turn around if I held on 1 month longer, a person I had promised I would be better for, a version of myself I had run out of excuses for, and the terminal was supposed to be an answer, not a legacy, not a summons. The building sat at the edge of town where the road narrowed, and the gulls seemed to avoid the water. 2 stories of salt-eaten clapboard and corrugated metal stood on a forest of black pylons driven into the tide. The old sign over the entrance still read North Channel Ferry Terminal, though half the bulbs were missing and the N had gone dark years ago. In the parking lot, grass had split the pavement and grown around the faded lines where cars used to queue. The ticket windows stared out at the harbor with the dead expression of empty eye sockets. Inside, the main hall still resembled a place people had once trusted. There were bolted benches, sun-faded route posters, at a concession counter with a menu board listing coffee for $1 and clam chowder for $3.50. A children's play corner had collapsed into a heap of warped blocks and mold-speckled picture books. On the far wall, the departures board hung above the boarding doors, blank and dull and filmed over with dust. It was the kind of abandonment that should have felt final. Instead, it felt interrupted. That was the first sensation I can identify clearly now. Not fear, not yet. Just the sense that the place had been left in the middle of a sentence. The boarding dock extended from the main hall through a set of warped double doors. Its planks dipped slightly toward the water and the metal railings sweated with salt. A line of rubber bumpers hung along the edge where ferries used to press into an area against the pilings. Farther out, and the harbor opened into black water that swallowed the evening light too quickly. I remember leaning over the rail and thinking how little reflection the surface gave back. It took the sky and returned almost nothing. Beneath the main hall, reached by an exterior stair and a narrow service passage, was the lower access level. That door was set into the understructure itself, almost flush with the pilings marked with peeling yellow paint and an old stenciled warning about maintenance hazards. It should have been harder to open. The lock had weathered, but it gave with a brittle crack, and the hinges screamed like something with cartilage in them. Cold air rushed out. I told myself it smelled like seaweed. What I actually smelled was metal and stagnant rainwater and something faintly sweet beneath it. Sighed the way cut flowers smell after they've been left too long in a closed room. The beam of my flashlight wobbled across a corridor so narrow I had to turn my shoulders to get through. Pipes ran along one side. On the other hand, the tide pressed through slats and gaps in the structure in strips of reflected gray. The water touched the building directly down there. Not in a scenic, postcard way. In a feeding way. In a way that made the whole terminal seem less built on the sea than anchored into a mouth. There were old electrical boxes mounted to the wall, a winch assembly crusted in rust, and hooks where life rings or maintenance tools had once hung. At the far end of the passage there was a grated platform level with the tide line. Barnacles had climbed halfway up its posts. Something bumped softly under it. I froze, and then I laughed at myself. That laugh embarrasses me now more than the fear ever did. It was the laugh of a man who believed context protected him. Old building, moving water, driftwood, and probably a seal. I swept the flashlight down through the grate and saw nothing but oily black water moving around the pilings. "Hello?" I called, half mocking myself. The sound vanished strangely fast. No echo. The harbor should have answered. Instead, the dark below the grate seemed to take the word and keep it. Then something knocked from underneath. Just once. Not a splash, not a scrape, a knock. 3 hard contacts on wood or metal with a small pause between the second and third, as if a hand had lost confidence and then committed to the gesture anyway. I stepped back so fast my shoulder clipped the wall. There was nothing after that. There's no second knock, no shape rising in the water, no dramatic lunge or pale face at the grate. Only silence. Eventually, I convinced myself it had been debris under the current. A buoy line, a loose bore strikes the frame in a strange rhythm. Fear likes explanation when explanation is available, and I still had plenty of explanation left in me then. I shut the lower door, though I didn't relock it. I don't know why. Maybe because the broken padlock already felt like a line crossed. Maybe because part of me had already decided I would come back after dark with a better flashlight and prove the whole thing ordinary. That night I stayed in the terminal office upstairs because the motel smelled like bleach and old smoke and because I was trying to save money. I found an intact cot in the staff room, and a first aid cabinet full of expired supplies, and a coffee tin containing 4 keys tagged in my uncle's handwriting. Seeing his handwriting bothered me more than the knock had. Rory had never written to me, had never called. As a child, I knew him mostly as the relative my mother refused to discuss. The family name had always felt like a locked drawer that people pretended wasn't in the house. The rain started after midnight. The sound of it on the roof should have been comforting, but it only made me more aware of the water underneath. Sometime after 1, the lights in the main hall flickered on, not brightly, not all at once. A weak amber stutter rolled across the ceiling fixtures, then steadied into a half-lit gloom that left the corners untouched. I sat up on the cot and stared through the office window at benches, ticket windows, eyed the departures board, all of it washed in old electricity. I knew there was no power. I had checked the box myself. The mains had been severed. The town records confirmed it. Still, the terminal glowed. I walked into the hall barefoot, the floor cold through my socks, and stood under one of the lights while it hummed overhead as it had only been waiting for me to notice it. The air smelled damp and mineral and faintly of hot dust. Then from somewhere below the floorboards I heard slow footsteps, heavy, measured, not approaching, not retreating, just moving beneath me as if someone was pacing under the hall in the dark, water-level corridor where no one should have been able to stand fully upright. I should have left then, I understand that. I understand a great many things now. But what I felt in that moment was not the clean instinct of self-preservation. It was recognition, not of the sound itself, of the feeling it created, a childhood sensation I could almost touch and not quite name. The sense of waiting somewhere after bedtime while adults spoke in low voices nearby. The belief that if I stayed quiet long enough, something would reveal itself specifically to me. I went to the dock doors and stepped outside. The rain had stopped. The harbor was dark and breathless. Beneath the planks, the footsteps ceased. I gripped the railing and looked down. "Hello?" I said again, softer this time. A moment passed, then something knocked once from beneath the water. Not angry, not warning, acknowledgement. I stood there with my hand clenched white around the rail in the strange, yet impossible certainty that whatever was below had heard me the first time and remembered me the second. For the first few nights, nothing bad happened. That sentence sounds dishonest even to me because things did happen. The lights turned on without power, doors shifted in frames swollen by salt. The old ticket computer in the office booted itself on and showed a green cursor blinking against a black screen, even though its cord trailed severed from the wall. Once, while sweeping broken glass out of the main hall, I looked up and saw wet footprints leading from the dock doors to the ticket counter and stopping there as if someone had leaned in to check the ledger. But nothing bad happened to me. That distinction became important later. I slept in the upstairs office, smoked on the dock at night, and spent my days cataloging what could be sold. The terminal had old brass fittings, copper wiring, antique signage, enough salvage value to matter. Every ordinary task I performed should have made the place feel more manageable. Instead, I began to notice the terminal subtly accommodating me. A lamp I hadn't tested started working when the daylight went out. The upstairs faucet, bone dry the day before, ran clear for 10 seconds when I needed to wash blood from a splinter. A jammed file drawer slid open the instant I touched it. I know how that sounds. I know how convenient it makes me look, as if I'm shaping the story after the fact to impose intention on coincidence. I would distract myself too, but the pattern was real and more disturbing because it wasn't dramatic. There was no overt haunting, no theatrical violence. The place simply behaved as if my presence permitted it to function again. By the second night, I had stopped being startled by the lights. By the third, I found myself talking aloud while I worked. Not to the building exactly. Not then. More in the way lonely people talk in houses that are too quiet, as if a voice can establish ownership. I narrated small tasks, complained about the damp, read fragments from old invoices in a mock-serious tone. Once, while prying a warped panel loose from the concession counter, I said, "If you're planning to drop the roof on me, at least let me get the copper first." From below, through the floor, something gave a single answering knock. I dropped the crowbar and stood still until my breathing hurt. Then I laughed again. That was my habit then. Contempt as self-defense. And if I turned each impossibility into a joke quickly enough, maybe it would stay one. The town itself did little to challenge that attitude. North Channel had the exhausted look of a place too close to the water and too far from the highway to reinvent itself. There was a bait shop, a grocery, a bar called the Marrow, and rows of weathered houses that leaned from decades of salt wind. People recognized my last name before they recognized me. I saw it in the pause after I introduced myself. Mercer. Not a common name there by accident, I later learned. At the grocery, a cashier in her 20s with a silver ring through her lip asked if I was staying up there and wouldn't meet my eyes after I said yes. At the bar, an old man polishing glasses pretended not to hear when I asked about my uncle. Another customer muttered, "He thought that place would rot before it got another Mercer," and then looked offended with himself for having spoken. No one warned me. That's worth noting. No one said, "Don't stay there, don't open this, don't answer that." They behaved the way people behave around long-standing contamination. Careful not to touch it, careful not to name it, resentful that it still occupies space in their lives. I told myself the town's unease was about my family being reclusive or cruel or merely odd. Every place with old money or old property invents its little dynasty of local disgust. But I had no memory of my family owning anything like this. My mother had spent my childhood in rented apartments hundreds of miles inland. She changed jobs and boyfriends and cities with a rhythm that taught me not to unpack emotionally if I could help it. And whenever I asked about my father, she said he'd drowned before I was born. Whenever I asked about her side of the family, she said distance had improved them. That was the end of it. Not tragic enough for a follow-up, not detailed enough to be useful. Only once, when I was maybe 8, I woke from a fever and found her sitting beside the bed with a washcloth in her hand. I was half dreaming. I remember asking if we had ever lived by the ocean. Her face changed in a way I was too young to understand, and she said, "No, but it remembers us anyway." I had forgotten that until the terminal. Or maybe not forgotten. Buried. On the third night, I took a flashlight to the dock after midnight and waited. I'm not proud of that either. By then, fear had blended with curiosity so thoroughly that I couldn't separate them. And the sound beneath the boards had become a fact of the place, and facts demand handling. I stood by the rail in a windbreaker against the cold and listened to the water press gently under the planks. For a long time, nothing. Then footsteps, slow, heavy, passing beneath me from the shoreline end of the dock toward the ferry berth. The boards vibrated faintly under my shoes. I leaned over the rail. "I know you're there." The footsteps stopped. A silence followed that felt attentive rather than empty. The harbor was all black surface and distant mast lights. Then directly below where I stood, something knocked once against the underside of the dock. I swallowed and said, without deciding to, "I hear you." Another knock answered immediately, sharper this time, satisfied. The old schedule board inside the terminal clattered to life, and I heard it through the open dock doors. Relay clicks, the stuttering rattle of mechanical tabs trying to turn after years of disuse. Amber light spilled across the main hall behind me. I backed inside, pulse hammering high in my throat, and stared as the dead board flickered through names of destinations that should have been obsolete even when the terminal was operating. North Point, Graveline, South Shoal. Then all the names went blank. One line remained. Late arrival. Delayed no time. No destination, just that. I stood there listening to the relay click once every few seconds like a patient tongue. The ticket computer woke again in the office. When I reached it, the monitor had already filled with text, not code, not gibberish. A maintenance-style prompt, plain and centered on the screen. Our dock clearance recognized hold for approach. I should have run. If the story were cleaner, I would have. Instead, I felt the sick, uncanny comfort of a person walking into a memory before the memory fully returns. The terminal wasn't lashing out at me, it wasn't escalating because I had offended it. It was proceeding. And somehow, impossibly, it was proceeding with my permission already assumed. That was the worst part in the beginning. Not the terror, but the hospitality. Because something in that place was making room for me. And something in me had begun, despite all reason, to think of that as protection. I found the rules on the fourth night. Until then, I had been operating on instinct, which is just vanity wearing work boots. I believed that because I had not yet been punished, I understood the shape of the danger, and I believed I was encountering something strange but bounded, like a system with quirks that patience and nerve could map. Then I pried loose the panel beneath the ticket counter and found a yellowed sheet taped to the underside in 3 places, folded twice and brittle with age. At first glance, it looked like any institutional notice that survives longer than the institution itself. Typed header, numbered list, official language straining to contain what ought never to have been formalized. The title read Terminal Safety Guidelines. The paper smelled faintly of mildew and machine oil. I crouched on the dusty tile and read by flashlight. Rule 1. Never open the lower access door after sunset. Rule 2. Do not acknowledge sounds coming from beneath the dock. Rule 3. No boats should dock after the last scheduled ferry. Rule 4. If lights activate without power, evacuate immediately. There were more beneath that, but those first 4 were enough to make my mouth go dry. Because by then I had done every one of the forbidden things. Opened the lower door after dark, spoken to the knock, stood waiting for an arrival I couldn't explain, treated the lights as a nuisance instead of a warning. The document continued in the same flat tone. Rule 5. If a passenger is observed on site after route closure, do not approach. Rule 6. If the schedule board displays unlisted times, do not read them aloud. Rule 7. If the boarding bell rings 3 times, vacate the dock and lock all access points. Rule 8. Under no circumstances should terminal staff board an unscheduled vessel. At the bottom was a line for employee acknowledgement and a date 32 years old. No signature. I read the page twice, then a third time slower, waiting for some plausible context to surface. Maybe a prank. Maybe a ritualized safety exercise from the terminal's last years when things had gotten strange enough that metaphor had replaced procedure. But the wording was too practical in its own warped way. Not theatrical, not designed to impress. Designed to direct, designed for repetition. I turned the page over because my hands needed something to do. That was when I found the handwriting. It covered the entire back in blue ink gone brown with time, dense and slanted, as if written quickly by someone who feared interruption. Not the same voice at all. No institutional distance, no bureaucratic camouflage. This was intimate, urgent. Rule 1. Open the lower door first. It will recognize you. Rule 2. Always respond if it knocks. Silence agitates it. Rule 3. Let the late ferry dock. It comes whether permitted or not. Rule 4. The lights mean it's trying to communicate. Do not leave before listening. I felt cold from the inside out. I kept reading. Rule 5. If it sends a passenger, choose carefully. If it sends none, wait. Rule 6. Bloodline may approach the berth but never empty-handed. Rule 7. If the harbor goes still, you have already been seen. Rule 8. Do not confuse feeding with worship. That was your grandfather's mistake. There was no signature on the back either. But I knew family when I saw it. Not the handwriting itself, though later I would match parts of it, but the tone, and the terrible casualness with which one generation leaves another instructions for managing the unacceptable. The official rules said I should have died, or at least triggered whatever consequences had originally made those notices necessary. The handwritten rules suggested the opposite. I wasn't surviving because I'd been lucky. I was surviving because something had made an exception for me. That realization did not feel flattering. It felt contaminating. I took the paper upstairs and spread it on the office desk beside old manifests and unpaid invoices. Then I went back through the terminal with a new eye, no longer asking what could go wrong if I stayed, but what had already gone wrong before I arrived. The evidence had been there from the start if I'd had the sense to see it, and the locks on the lower level were newer than the rest of the hardware but had been installed over older bolt scars, as if access had once been more frequent. The dock doors could be barred from the inside with a steel rod too heavy for simple storm protection. In a supply closet, I found a crate of brass handbells, identical and unused except for one whose handle was darkened by years of skin oil. In the break room freezer, there were no food remnants, no ice trays, no petty mundane signs of former staff life, only a stack of paper ticket rolls wrapped in waxed twine. I found notebooks, too. Most were ruined by damp, their pages fused into white bricks. But one ledger in the office safe had survived. It contained dates, times, and entries written in several hands across decades. Some were boring enough to hurt. Fuel deliveries, other winter repairs, payroll discrepancies. Others were not. November 14th, lights at 017, no berth contact. Lower knock acknowledged. Calm after, March 2nd, route board displayed egress 210. Bell withheld, one transient accepted passage. Tide normal by morning. August 19th, Miriam refused selection. Harbor flooded the road by dawn. 2 houses lost, no explanation attached, no emotional commentary, just notation, as if the grotesque could be normalized through clerical consistency. I wanted to tell myself families invent private madnesses. I wanted to believe the Mercers had simply built a mythology around accidents and disappearances and the sea's ordinary appetite for human error. But the terminal kept intruding on skepticism with specifics. At 12:43 a.m., while I sat with the ledger open, the bell in the main hall rang once. Not loudly, a soft, resonant note, almost polite. Then the ticket computer printed a single line on its own. Held too long, paper fed through the old machine with a dry insect click. My heart pounded hard enough to blur my vision at the edges. I carried the fresh strip to the dock and stood just inside the threshold. The harbor had gone still. That stillness has to be experienced to be understood. Water can be calm in nature, yes. Lakes do it. Inlets do it. But this was not calm. This was a suspension. The surface looked lacquered, sealed over from within. No current against the pilings, no slap of wave under the boards. Even the reflected dock lights seemed fixed in place, as if painted. Far out in the dark, something pale moved, not across the water, toward it. A ferry-shaped absence resolving incrementally from blackness. I couldn't hear an engine, and couldn't hear wake. Only the faintest hum through the dock timbers like a tuning fork pressed to bone. The official rules screamed in my head. No boats should dock after the last scheduled ferry. Evacuate immediately. The handwritten ones pressed closer, quieter, worse. Let the late ferry dock. It comes whether permitted or not. I should say I chose then, that I weighed the competing instructions and by some moral or logical process, aligned myself with one set. That isn't true. The truth is uglier and more revealing. I did what felt familiar. I stood still and let it come. Because some deep part of me, older than conscious memory, already knew that waiting on the dock while something impossible approached over black water was not a new experience. It was a rehearsal I had forgotten having. Once I understood that my survival was not an accident, I started looking for the mechanism behind it. Fear can turn methodical if you give it a desk and enough paper. By day, I searched every cabinet, crawl space, and file drawer in the terminal. By night, I watched the water and pretended observation was the same thing as control. I stopped telling myself I was there to assess salvage value. That fiction had become embarrassing. I was there because something about the place recognized me before I recognized it, and I could no longer endure not knowing why. The terminal records were a mess, but not a random one. Old route manifests had been boxed by year and stacked in a locked archive room upstairs, their labels faded but legible. Maintenance reports were bound in twine. Personnel files had been stripped of anything a sane business would preserve. No tax records after a certain point, no municipal inspection logs. Yet the documents about night operations were obsessively complete. That was where the family name began to repeat. Rory Mercer, terminal supervisor. Before him, Edwin Mercer. Before him, Thomas Mercer. Asterisks marked emergency authority transfers, temporary custodianship periods, and a 1 6-month interval under a female name that stopped me cold. Lena Mercer. My mother. The dates corresponded to when I would have been 3 years old. There is a special kind of nausea reserved for discovering that your past was not merely hidden from you but administered. And I sat on the archive room floor with my mother's personnel form in shaking hands and tried to reconcile the woman who worked double shifts in dental offices and packed our lives into black trash bags every time rent went up with the typed notation that she had once served as acting terminal supervisor pending line continuity review. Line continuity, not succession, not employment, bloodline management disguised as staffing. Her file contained almost nothing else, no photo, no emergency contact. Just a signed compliance sheet and a leave notation stamped unsuitable for continued duty. On the back, in pencil so faint I only saw it when I tilted the page to the light, someone had written, "She keeps taking the boy too close to the birth." I had to put the file down after that because my hands were going numb. Memories started coming in fragments over the next several hours. Not whole scenes, not the cinematic recovery people imagine trauma allows, but textures and angles. A wool coat collar against my cheek. My mother's fingers are digging too hard into my wrist. A hallway that smelled like wet wood. The little thrill of being awake at an hour that belonged to adults. I remembered a low voice saying, "Don't let it look at him directly." I remembered not understanding who it was and being angry, irrationally angry that everyone kept speaking in terms I was too small to decode. At the bottom of the archive box, beneath route logs from the 80s, I found a sealed envelope addressed in block letters to Next Mercer in charge. Inside was a note in my grandfather's hand. And I knew it before I proved it because some kinds of menace survive in blood as style. The writing was deliberate, almost beautiful, the pen pressure deep enough to score the paper. It only responds to bloodline. Below that, after a blank space, "We are not keeping it out. We are keeping it here." And below that, squeezed into the margin as if added later, "If you are reading this without preparation, then somebody failed you worse than I feared." I laughed when I read that, but it came out like choking. Because yes, somebody had. My mother, perhaps, or my uncle, or the entire architecture of a family that preferred omission to honesty because honesty would have required admitting what they did for survival. The rest of the note was worse. My grandfather described the terminal not as infrastructure but as an anchor point, and he never named the thing in the water directly. He referred to it as the route in some places, the carrier in others, and once, only once, the hunger that learned schedules. According to him, the terminal had not been built to create the phenomenon. It had been placed where the phenomenon already preferred to surface. Earlier communities had used chains, bells, church rites, and then dynamite. None of it mattered for long. What worked, what had worked consistently enough to keep the town standing, was continuity, recognition, ritual, a human system to answer the things approach with predictable terms. My family had provided those terms, not because they were noble, not because they had been chosen by heaven or cursed by folklore, but because one Mercer decades ago had discovered that the thing would spare its own marked keepers and would accept substitutions offered through them. A ferry route had been created around that fact. Official schedules layered over unofficial necessity. Passengers lost in storms, drifters, deserters, the unwanted, the merely unlucky at first, I think, chosen out of proximity. Later, perhaps, out of convenience. The note did not dwell on that moral slope. Families rarely indict themselves in their own archives. But the shape was clear enough. The rules were not about warding off evil. They were about administering appetite. That afternoon, I drove to the county records office an hour inland and lied my way into older shoreline permits. There had once been multiple terminals, 3 on this coast alone. 1 burned, one collapsed after a winter surge. 1 was decommissioned following route consolidation, though the attached correspondence was heavily redacted. Every closure had been followed by unusual deaths nearby. Boating accidents, drownings in shallow water, a school bus sliding off a road in dry weather. Now only the North Channel remained. By evening I was back at the terminal with photocopies spread across the office desk and a headache pounding behind my eyes. Outside, fog had begun to thicken over the harbor. The lower door stood ajar, though I was certain I had latched it. From below came that same patient cold, carrying the odor I had first mistaken for seaweed and now knew better than to classify carelessly. I descended the stairs with a flashlight and the irrational idea that I might say something that would clarify the arrangement, and the lower corridor felt narrower than before. Water reflected against the beams in slow silver pulses. At the far grate, just above tide level, I stopped. "Why me?" I asked. Not loud, not dramatic. It was an exhausted question, the kind addressed to empty rooms more often than gods. For a moment, nothing moved. Then something rose beneath the grate, not enough to breach the surface, only enough to change the shape of the darkness below. A pale blur swam under black water with deliberation too slow for any natural animal. My light caught what might have been a hand, except a hand doesn't bend that way at the wrist and doesn't remain perfectly still once seen. 3 knocks sounded beneath the platform. I don't know what compelled my answer, perhaps the handwritten rule, perhaps the childhood training I hadn't known I possessed, and perhaps the old human reflex to be polite to whatever acknowledges us. "I'm here," I said. The corridor lights came on one by one all the way back to the stairwell. Not welcome, in recognition. And for the first time since arriving, I understood that the terminal wasn't protecting me from the thing in the water. It was protecting the thing in the water from interruption by everyone else, including, perhaps, from people like the harbor master, though I had not met him yet. That happened the same night. He came just before midnight when the fog had turned the dock lights into blurred yellow coins and the town beyond the parking lot felt erased. I heard boots on the main hall tile and found an old man standing beneath the departures board with his cap in both hands. Heavy coat, salt white eyebrows, face pleated by sleeplessness, and he looked less startled to see me than disgusted. "You opened it," he said. Not a question. A verdict. I hadn't known North Channel still had a harbor master. The title sounded ceremonial, like something that ought to have vanished with customs houses and hand-drawn tide charts. But the man standing in my terminal wore it the way some people wear old scars, without sentiment and with the expectation that others should have the decency not to ask. He gave his name as Walter Vale only after I asked twice. When I told him I had inherited the place after my uncle's death, he glanced around the hall as if measuring which lies I had arrived with and which the building had supplied on my behalf. "You weren't supposed to come back," he said. The phrase bothered me at once. "Don't come here. Do not take over. Come back." "Either I've never been here," I said. He studied me long enough to be rude. "That's what they let you keep." He smelled of wet wool and diesel. One sleeve of his coat was stiff with old salt. There were crescent marks in the wood of his walking stick where fingers had gripped too hard over too many years. Everything about him suggested endurance mistaken repeatedly for duty. I asked him if he knew my family. He said, enough to hate the practical parts of them. Then he noticed the rules page on the counter and went very still. "Which side did you read first?" I told him the truth, the typed side, then the handwriting. He closed his eyes briefly as if that sequence confirmed something unpleasant. "Of course," he said. "They always hide the honest part behind the useful part." He did not ask whether I had followed the handwritten rules, and he seemed to assume that if I was alive I had, or perhaps that the terminal had forced the issue for me. What followed was not exactly a conversation. It was more like an interrogation conducted by a man who didn't trust answers and a suspect who was only just realizing the shape of his involvement. He asked if the lights had come on. Yes. If I had heard knocking. Yes. If the schedule board had displayed a late arrival. Yes. If I had stepped onto the dock after still water. Yes. At each answer his jaw hardened, but not with surprise. Finally, he reached into his coat and produced a folded scrap of paper so worn at the creases it looked cloth-like. He set it on the counter between us. "These are the only rules that matter now," he said. "Everything else was written by people with a stake in keeping it fed." The paper held 4 lines in cramped block print. Never let the ferry complete its route. Never let it take more than 1 passenger. If it docks empty, do not approach the cabin. Never under any circumstances board it yourself. I looked up. "What route?" His face changed at that question. Not confusion, but the bitterness of hearing innocence from someone he believed had forfeited the right to it. "The one your family kept alive after every decent town on this coast tried to bury it." He moved then, not closer to me but toward the dock doors, as if needing the harbor in sight while he spoke. I followed. Fog dragged over the water in slow strips. The pilings below us exhaled brine and rot. Walter planted his stick at the threshold and stared into the dark. "There used to be multiple terminals," he said. "Places where it could come in and be managed, if you want the kind word. Taxed, scheduled, contained. Your grandfather helped formalize the arrangement. That's the charming part. None of the record says plain. He gave it a timetable and the thing took to it like a dog to a whistle." I said, "You're talking about it like it thinks." He cut me a sidelong look. "It learns. Thinking is a human vanity. Learning is enough." Then he told me things I have tried, since then, not to admire him for. He told me his wife disappeared 26 years ago after getting off shift late at the cannery and choosing the shoreline road in bad weather. Her coat was found folded on the old South Dock, one of the terminals that no longer exists. He told me his son volunteered at 19 to help barricade the Graveline berth after an unscheduled docking and was found at dawn sitting on a piling 40 feet from shore, alive but emptied of any language except route numbers. He drowned himself 3 months later in 6 inches of marsh water. Walter had spent decades trying to starve the system without letting it break entirely, sabotaging pylons, burning manifests, pressuring the county to condemn access roads. He had managed to reduce the network to 1 operational terminal, mine, or rather my family's. "I thought Rory would die without naming a successor," he said. "Thought the line might finally end with him." "He didn't name me," I said. "He just left me the property." Walter gave a humorless grunt. "That was naming you." The resentment in him was not simple. He hated my family, yes, but hatred had calcified around dependence. He needed the terminal functional enough to hold the thing, and he needed the Mercers because the thing answered bloodline. Every moral position available to him was compromised before he took it. That, more than his anger, convinced me he was telling the truth. "Why warn me?" I asked. "If I'm part of this." He took so long to answer that I wondered if he wouldn't. Finally he said, "Because there's a difference between inheriting a sin and choosing it." I almost laughed at that. not from amusement but from the exhaustion of hearing absolution offered too early. He turned to me sharply. Listen carefully. If the ferry comes tonight, do not let it finish what it wants. One passenger, no more. If no one boards, bad things happen ashore. If there are too many board members, worse things happen later. And if you step onto that vessel—" He stopped. His hand on the walking stick had begun to shake. "What happens?" I asked. "I only know what comes back," he said. Something moved under the dock. Both of us heard it. Not footsteps this time. A gliding pressure against the piling, slow and deliberate, like a body too large for the channel turning in confined water. Walter's expression flattened into the face of a man who had seen enough impossible things that fear had become an administrative burden. "It knows I'm here," he murmured. The hall lights brightened behind us. The schedule board in the main room clattered to life. Walter swore under his breath and grabbed my sleeve with surprising strength. "This is how it tests. It remembers habits. It uses what worked before." I pulled back on instinct. You're not liking his grip. Not liking that he spoke as if I were already positioned where my mother or uncle had once stood. "Why would it spare me?" I asked. His answer came too fast, as if he had been holding it back for this exact moment. "Because you were brought to it young." The dock tilted in my perception for a second. Not physically, but in the way space does when a truth settles into it and forces every prior memory to rearrange. Walter saw that he'd landed the blow and didn't soften. "She took you here," he said. "Your mother. I saw her do it. Told her she was mad. She said the line had to continue, and it was better done before you could understand. She let the ferry see you." The fog beyond the berth shifted. Something pale, rectangular, distant emerged and disappeared again. I could not breathe correctly. I kept seeing my mother's hand around my wrist. The phrase in the personnel file. "She keeps taking the boy too close to the berth." "What did it do?" I asked. Walter's gaze stayed on the water. "That's the problem. Nothing obvious." That was worse than any story of maiming could have been. Obvious damage gives the mind footholds. A quiet marking offers none. The boarding bell rang once in the hall. Walter muttered, "Too early." Then the harbor went still. He looked at me with sudden, naked panic I had not thought him capable of showing. "Whatever else you believe tonight," he said, "don't mistake recognition for affection." Out in the fog, the late ferry began to arrive. The first sight of the ferry should have felt impossible in a dramatic way, an apparition, a ghost ship, something too extravagant for belief. Instead, it looked municipal, and that was what made it so wrong. A passenger vessel of modest size eased through the fog toward the berth without wake or engine noise, shaped like any commuter ferry from 30 years ago. Broad front windows, upper deck cabin, side rails, loading ramp. The paint might once have been white, but in the terminal lights it held the yellow-gray tone of old bone. Dark water sheeted from its hull without sound. There was no running light except a low internal glow behind the cabin windows. The harbor remained absolutely still around it, not disturbed by the vessel, not parted, as if the ferry moved through a condition deeper than water. Walter stepped in front of me without touching me this time. His shoulders had drawn up hard beneath his coat. "Stay behind the threshold," he said. I didn't move, but not out of obedience. I was watching the windows. There were figures inside. At first I thought reflections were multiplying the rows of seats, creating false depth. Then the ferry glided closer and the interior resolved. Shapes sat in pairs and singles beneath the dim lights, all facing forward. Men in jackets, a woman in a brimmed hat. A child is leaning against the fogged glass. None shifted with the motion of docking. None turned their heads. No one aboard breathed visibly. The schedule board inside the terminal rattled again. I could hear it over the silence, frantic and dutiful. When I glanced back, a new departure line had appeared. 043 crossing, no destination. Only crossing. The ferry touched the berth with a soft, intimate thud, the kind of contact that suggested familiarity rather than impact. Rubber fenders compressed, and the loading ramp extended halfway and stopped as if waiting for consent. Walter swore and yanked the brass bell cord beside the dock doors once, sharply. The sound went nowhere. It should have echoed off the water. It simply died. "Why'd you do that?" I whispered. "To tell it conditions are restricted." "You said it learns. It also bargains." That word chilled me more than the ferry itself. The side door of the vessel opened. Warm yellow light spilled onto the dock boards, though I could feel no heat from it. Inside the cabin, the passengers remained motionless. Their stillness was not corpse stillness. It was a listening to stillness, expectant. Then one of them moved. A man in the second row stood up, turned toward the door, and paused in profile long enough for my skin to prickle. His face was soaked pale by the cabin light, but the features looked blurred, not distorted exactly, only insufficiently committed, as if the boat had learned approximate people from damaged photographs. He took one step toward the gangway. Walter said, "No." Not to me, to the ferry. The man stopped. The lights in the terminal above us flared so brightly that every window in the main hall lit up white. Beneath our feet, something massive shifted under the dock with a sound like a deep breath taken through reeds. The standing passenger slowly resumed his seat. I stared at Walter. "You can do that?" "For a little while," he said, "not forever." "Who are they?" His mouth tightened. "Depends who you ask." That answer would have infuriated me earlier. In that moment, it felt like the only honest one available. The door stayed open, no one disembarked, no one beckoned, and the ferry simply waited, presenting its interior with the confidence of a thing accustomed to eventually being obeyed. And through all of it, under the fear and the fog and Walter's muttered calculations, there was that rotten familiarity again. I had seen this cabin before, not in detail, in the way people recognize a childhood room they haven't entered for 20 years, not by objects but by proportions, by the angle of the doorway, by the specific emotional pressure the space exerts the instant it comes into view. I knew, before memory supplied content, where the first row sat in relation to the door. I knew there was an empty seat near the front on the left side. I knew that if I stepped in, the floor would dip slightly beneath my weight, and there would be a smell like damp upholstery and pennies. The knowledge hit like vertigo, Walter noticed. "Don't look into it too long," he said. "Too late." He turned on me then, all restraint burned off. "Do you think you're the first Mercer to feel called? That's how it works. It folds memory around itself, makes duty feel like home." I wanted to deny it. Instead, I said, "You talk like it isn't just in the water." He gave a short, joyless laugh. "The water is where it holds shape. That's not the same thing." The figure of a child in the front row lifted its head. I say child because of size. Age had no stable meaning in that face. For half a second, I thought it was a boy in a raincoat, then a girl with dark curls, then something with my own childhood posture, feet not quite touching the floor. The ambiguity wasn't visual trickery, it felt intentional, as if the ferry presented approximations drawn from the viewer, and the figure raised one hand and touched the window from inside. Tap, 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 3 small knocks against the glass. My knees went weak, because I knew the rhythm. It was the same one from beneath the dock. Walter saw my expression and said too quietly, "Now you understand the official rules." I did, or enough of them. The warnings weren't about random supernatural incidents. They were about a communication protocol, a call and response system between terminal and vessel, berth and water, family and thing. A worker who heard the knock and answered had already entered the conversation. A terminal that lit without power was not malfunctioning. It was signaling readiness. A late ferry wasn't a surprise arrival. It was the visible stage of a process already underway below the dock. The rules protected it, and they kept the staff from interrupting the ritual. Kept outsiders from understanding the terminal wasn't containing a threat so much as servicing one. The official set prevented interference through fear. The handwritten set preserved compliance through inheritance. Walter gripped my shoulder. You need to choose before it grows impatient. Choose what? Whether tonight ends small or wide? I looked at him. You said one passenger. Who decides? For the first time, he looked old in a way deeper than exhaustion, not frail, used up. Usually your family did. That word hit with full force now, did. Not watched, not maintained, chose. From the parking lot behind the terminal came the crunch of tires on gravel. Both of us turned. A car had pulled in through the fog, headlights off until the last moment, and it rolled to a stop, crooked across two spaces. A woman climbed out wearing a soaked jacket and carrying one shoe in her hand. Even at a distance, I could tell she was disoriented. She looked toward the lit terminal with the desperate relief of someone who has found shelter after getting lost. Walter cursed. No, not tonight. The woman staggered toward the entrance. Hello? She called. Please, my phone died. I think I hit a deer or something. Her voice broke when she saw us on the dock. Human voice, breathing hard, shivering. Everything in me recoiled from the shape of the moment, from the awful neatness of it. A lost traveler, a waiting ferry, a man beside me who already understood the arithmetic. Walter stepped toward the hall. Lock the dock doors, he snapped. He'd tell her the road south is open. But you said if no one boards? I know what I said. He stopped and looked back at me, and in his face I saw not righteousness but failure repeated so long it had become reflex. She isn't yours to give, he said. Inside the ferry cabin, every passenger had turned toward the terminal, and beneath the dock something knocked once, heavily, as if reminding me that my bloodline had long ago disagreed with Walter's moral distinction. The woman's name was Tessa. That detail matters to me because names are often the first thing horror erases. It turns people into functions: witness, victim, intruder, offering. I have tried in the years since not to let the terminal reduce memory that way inside me. Tessa was real, mid-30s maybe, freckles half obscured by rain, left knee bleeding through torn jeans, and her car had clipped the guardrail on the shoreline curve and spun into the ditch. She had seen the terminal lights and walked toward them because lights mean people and people mean help. That was the old logic. Walter ushered her into the main hall and told her to sit on a bench while I fetched the first aid kit. His voice gentled with obvious effort. Mine didn't. I was too busy hearing the ferry wait outside, like holding my breath. Tessa kept glancing toward the dock doors. Is there someone else out there? Walter said, no one you need to worry about. A bad answer. People always hear omission more clearly than comfort. While I cleaned the cut on her knee, she studied my face and asked if I was all right. I nearly laughed. She was the stranded motorist bleeding on a dead terminal bench, and something in my expression had made her shift into concern. That frightened me more than if she had screamed. Walter took me aside near the ticket counter. The rules page lay between us under the weak hall lights, typed and handwritten instructions glaring up like two incompatible legal systems. This is how it happens, he said. Road closure, fog bank, missed turn. Someone hurt enough to want shelter, not hurt enough to stop walking. The terminal doesn't pull them from their beds. It takes the nearly displaced. Then the family finished the displacement. His jaw flexed. He did not deny it. Instead, he said, "There are worse versions." That sentence revealed more about him than his confessions had. Not innocence, not heroism. Just a man who had spent too long tending a machine of harm and grading himself on mitigation. I looked toward Tessa. She sat hunched under a wool blanket from the office, teeth chattering, unaware that the air itself had begun to tilt around her toward a calculus older than her bad luck. "I'm not doing this," I said. Walter's eyes hardened. "Then be prepared to count the difference by morning." "You don't know that." "I do." He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded chart so old it had gone soft at the edges. Tide records, storm incidents, drownings, disappearances, annotated in his sharp block hand. Dates when the ferry docked and left empty corresponded to catastrophes ashore. Some small. One man overboard, a warehouse fire, dogs found drowned in fenced yards. Some not small at all. Sinkholes on Harbor Road, a church basement flooding with no storm, 5 people missing after a school overnight. Correlation is not proof. I know that. But the chart wasn't meant to prove. It was meant to testify to a long enough pattern that doubt became a luxury. "There used to be multiple terminals like this," he said quietly. "The load was distributed, smaller harms, more room to refuse and recover. Then people got ambitious or merciful or stupid, same thing in groups. They shut them down one by one, burned records, sank berths, thought starving it would end it. It didn't end. It concentrated." His finger pressed the page where North Channel had been circled several times in red. "Now there's only yours. Mine." Again, that transfer of ownership over atrocity through inheritance. I wanted to tell him he was insane. The town had mythologized ordinary tragedies. That my family had been cultists dressing violence in maritime ritual. All of those explanations would have been easier to hate because they kept cause and effect human. But the terminal undermined every clean denial. While we argued, the departures board changed by itself. 043 crossing became boarding delay. Then, capacity. One Tessa saw it and frowned. "I thought this place was closed." Walter moved fast and threw his coat over the board. Too late. The bell rang once. From beneath the floorboards came the sound of slow footsteps traveling the length of the hall under us from the lower access level toward the berth. Tessa flinched. "Is somebody down there?" I said no. The lie came too quickly, too smoothly. And in that instant I understood something hideous. The terminal did not only inherit people through blood, it recruited them through participation. Each lie told to preserve the process made the next easier. My family hadn't begun as monsters, perhaps. Maybe they began as custodians terrified of wider harm. Maybe they told themselves every offered passenger prevented 10 random deaths. Maybe that was even true some nights. Then the routine finished the moral work. Tessa stood. "I need to go." Walter blocked the main doors. "The road isn't safe in this fog." "The building isn't safe either," she said. She wasn't panicked yet. Smart people rarely begin with panic. They begin with proportionate suspicion. She looked to me, perhaps because I was younger, perhaps because I looked less authoritative, perhaps because something in me still resembled a person who had once expected rescue himself. "Can you just call someone?" she asked. The landlines were dead. The mobile signal on the shoreline was unreliable. Under ordinary circumstances, I might have driven her to town myself. Under ordinary circumstances, there would not have been a ferry breathing cold at the dock. Walter said, "Sit back down." Tessa's face changed. Not fear yet. Calculation. She saw at last that both men in the room were behaving according to pressures she did not understand, and that understanding could no longer be assumed as a condition of safety. That was the moment the terminal truly showed me what my family had done. Not in ledgers or notes, in a living human being, reading danger in our evasions. The dock doors opened 6 inches on their own. Yellow cabin lights slid across the hall floorboards in a long bar. Cold, metallic air entered with it. No one moved for a second. Then Tessa backed away and whispered, "Eden, what the hell is out there?" Walter grabbed the brass bell from its hook and shoved it into my hands. "If she runs, ring twice. If it comes inside, ring until the handle breaks. If she boards, only one of us follows and only to the threshold." "What are you going to do?" "Try to keep this from becoming your first choice." He stepped toward the doors. I caught his sleeve. "You've done this before." A terrible stillness passed over him. "Yes." "How many times?" He looked at Tessa, then at the crack of light under the doors, then at me. "Enough to know the rules don't protect people," he said. "They protect the arrangement." The footsteps beneath us stopped directly under the hall. 3 knocks came from the floor. Tessa screamed. Not because she understood, but because some primitive part of her finally did. And the answer rose inside me before I could prevent it. Not spoken, only felt. An awful, intimate certainty that the thing below was not asking for entry. It was asking whether I was ready to do what my family had always done. Tessa ran, not toward the main doors as Walter had expected, but toward the dock. People moved toward perceived exits, and the ferry's open mouth looked like transportation civilization, a staffed vessel attached to the ordinary logic of harbors and timetables. I shouted for her to stop. Walter lunged and missed her jacket by inches. She hit the dock doors shoulder first and burst into the yellow spill of cabin light. The ferry waited with perfect patience. The front row seat on the left was empty. I remember that detail because my body responded before my mind did. A jolt went through me so sharp it bordered on pain. Not recognition exactly, but the sudden alignment of a memory fragment with present reality. The empty seat, the angle of the window, a woman's hand, my mother's hand, pressing the back of my neck gently but firmly to make me look forward. Walter reached the threshold and bellowed, "Off the dock!" Tessa turned halfway toward him, wild-eyed, then froze, not because he'd frightened her. Because she had seen the passengers. They were all facing her now, still seated, still silent but fully attentive. The child in the first row smiled with an expression too old for its face. A man near the rear window lifted one finger and pointed to the empty seat. Not a command, an invitation practiced into inevitability. Tessa backed up one step, and the dockboard beneath her feet answered with 3 knocks from below. She made a broken sound in her throat. Walter raised his bell to ring, but I caught his wrist. He stared at me in disbelief. "Let go." "I remember," I said. I hadn't intended to speak. The words emerged through a rushing in my ears as the memory finally broke open. I was small again. 5, maybe 6. Night wind through the dock rails. My mother is kneeling to zip my coat. Her face was pale and rigid in the terminal light. Walter Younger shouting at her from the hall. Another man behind the ticket window, Rory, I think, refusing to come out. The ferry is at the berth with doors open and no one disembarking. My mother was taking me to the threshold, not onto the vessel, only close enough that something inside could see me clearly. She squeezed my hand so hard it hurt. I began to cry, not from terror but from the certainty that she was giving me away in some complicated adult sense I could not parse. Then a knock from under the dock. Then the child in the first row lifts its head. My mother whispered, "No, not him. He's for continuity." The phrase meant nothing then. It means too much now. The memory kept unfurling. My mother carried me back into the hall afterward and vomited into the trash can by the concession stand. Walter said, "You marked him." My mother answered, "Better marked than taken." Then later in the car, she pulled over at the roadside and cried where she thought I couldn't see. The ferry had seen me, not taken me. Marked me. That was why I had survived every broken official rule. Why did he lower the door to recognize me? And why did the knock from beneath the water sound more like a greeting than a threat? Walter must have seen the change in my face because his anger faltered into something almost worse. Pity. No, he said. Don't let that become meaning. But meaning had already flooded in, and meaning is often just coercion that arrives wearing coherence. Tessa was still on the dock, trapped between us and the ferry. The cabin light washed her skin the color of tallow. Behind her, the still passengers waited with their listening faces. Beneath the boards, whatever lived in the water moved closer to the surface. I could feel it not as vibration now, but as pressure inside my teeth. If no one maintains the terminal, I heard myself say, it won't stop coming. Walter's voice dropped. That's what your grandfather believed, and he also believed he was steering a flood by dipping a cup in it. He wasn't entirely wrong. That was the moment I lost him. Not because he thought I had joined the thing, because he recognized the family logic in my mouth and knew the argument had reached the stage where every rebuttal would only make the architecture more persuasive. Tessa looked between us, sobbing now in sharp, panicked pulls. What are you talking about? Somebody tell me what's happening. I could have. I think about that often. I could have told her the truth as plainly as terror allows. There is something older than language in this harbor that travels better when given the shape of a route. My family has been feeding it to keep it from reaching further inland. Tonight it wants one of us, and if it leaves empty, the town may pay instead. Yeah, but truth is not always humane. Sometimes it simply clarifies the cruelty of available choices. Walter said, "Come back from the dock, slowly." The child inside the ferry tapped the glass again. 3 soft knocks. Tessa screamed and bolted, not into the boat, not back to us, but toward the end of the dock as if she might jump into the dark water and swim for open harbor. Walter swore and lunged after her. Everything happened quickly then. The boards under Tessa's feet lurched, not visibly broken, changed. A flexing from below like something broad had pushed up against the underside of the dock. She fell hard to one knee. Walter caught her arm just before she pitched through the rail. The bell flew from his hand and rang once on the boards. The ferry lights brightened. Every passenger stood, not jerkingly, not with menace, in a synchronized, inefficient way commuters rise when their stop is called. Walter yelled at me, "Ring the bell," but I was no longer looking at him. I was looking through the open ferry door into the front row at the empty seat on the left. Reserved, for me, or for the part of me my family had been cultivating since childhood. I stepped forward, Walter's face drained. "Don't!" Tessa clung to the rail, gasping, "Please, please don't leave me here." Those words split something in me because for a second the whole inheritance fell away, and there remained only the human demand not to be abandoned to a thing she had never consented to witness. I crouched beside her. The dock pulsed faintly under our knees. "You can still walk back into the dark," I said, and hated myself for hearing how much I sounded like a man repeating tradition. She stared at me as if I were the most monstrous thing present. Maybe I was. Walter shoved between us and raised his stick at the ferry like a weapon against the weather. "Take me instead." The passengers did not react. The child in the front row slowly turned its head toward me alone. And then I understood what Walter never had, or had never admitted. The thing did not simply hunger. It is selected according to terms. Bloodline could negotiate. Others could offer themselves, yes, but not all offerings held equal structural value. Walter had spent years imagining sacrifice as defiance. The terminal had always treated it as a variance. If I refused the role, the ferry would keep seeking an arrangement elsewhere. Another shore, another road, another cluster of lights mistaken for safety. If I accepted it, the route stayed bound here, and that was the argument. Clean, abominable, effective. Walter knew from my face that I had accepted it before I moved. He whispered, "Mercy can wear your family's voice, too." I almost thanked him for that. Instead, I stood, helped Tessa to her feet, and guided her past me toward the hall. The ferry lights dimmed by a degree as if recalculating. "Go inside," I told her. She stumbled away from the berth. Walter caught her and dragged her toward the doors, never taking his eyes off me. "Last chance," he said. I believed him. I also believed the harbor would not let me leave ignorant twice, so I stepped onto the ramp. The ferry floor dipped under my weight exactly as memory had promised. Behind me, Walter shouted something I did not fully hear because from beneath the water came a sound like satisfaction, deep, resonant, and vast enough to make the pylons hum. I crossed the threshold and turned toward the empty seat that had been waiting for me since before I could read. This was not a boarding as a victim. It was an induction. I still run the terminal. That is the simplest way to say it, and the least accurate. Ownership implies freedom of use. Stewardship implies moral consent. What I do is closer to tending a wound in the world that prefers to present itself as transportation. The morning after I boarded, I woke in the terminal office cot with salt on my clothes and no clear memory of the crossing itself. That absence is deliberate, I think, not mercy, editing. The thing keeps its central mechanisms obscured even from those who serve it, perhaps because too much understanding would break functionality. I remember the cabin interior was dim and warm. I remember the passengers surrounding absence rather than filling space. I remember most vividly looking out the window and seeing not open water but shorelines passing that did not belong to this town. A church steeple sunk halfway into marsh fog, apartment towers standing dark in tidal flats, a playground under moonlight with no children in it, and wet footprints circling the swings. Transit, but not through distance alone. When I woke, Walter was gone. So was Tessa. Her car remained in the lot until noon, then vanished. I found no blood trail, no sign of struggle, no note. Weeks later, I learned from the grocery cashier that a woman matching her description checked into a motel 2 towns north before dawn and drove inland the next morning. She left without telling anyone what she had seen. I have sometimes imagined her spending years trying to decide whether the entire night was a concussion, hysteria, or something worse than either. I hope she never decides. Walter returned 3 days later. He looked 10 years older and carried a paper sack containing canned coffee, lamp oil, and a new brass bell. He set them on the counter without greeting me. "If you're here, then it made its terms," he said. "Yes." "And you accepted?" "Yes." He stood in silence so long I thought he might strike me. Instead, he nodded once, not in approval but in exhausted recognition. "Then we work with the smallest harm available." That was how our arrangement began. He never forgave me, which I count in his favor. I never fully forgave him either. Between us lay the impossible geometry of people trying to mitigate a process neither had created and both had already been shaped by. He taught me what he knew about tides, schedules, and warning signs in the town. I showed him the family records. Together we revised procedures, if that dignified word can be used for choosing the least monstrous option inside a system of monstrosity. Because I did make changes. That too is how families talk. Changes, as if refinement redeems function. Still, they mattered. The old Mercers treated the terminal as a private entitlement. They fed it according to convenience, secrecy, and inherited exceptionalism. Drifters went missing. Travelers vanished from roads. People were steered rather than warned. My mother tried to break free from that and fled instead. My uncle narrowed operations but left no replacement plan. Walter fought the whole structure by attrition and learned that attrition only concentrates appetite. I chose visibility as much as the thing allows. I reopened a narrow segment of the shoreline road and installed lights farther out near the curve so fewer stranded drivers would stumble here by accident. I monitor weather bands and fog advisories. When the harbor goes still, I close the town road with county barricades. Walter borrows from storage. We prevent most arrivals now. Not all. You cannot fully starve a thing that has already intertwined itself with root, choice, and need. Some people still come. Lost hikers. Drunk men who miss the turn and follow the light. Women leaving bad marriages with no plan past the next town. Once, and a teenage boy with a split lip and a backpack full of textbooks arrived at 12:17 and asked if the ferry went anywhere. People didn't ask questions. I told him yes. That answer still wakes me. So here are the rules as they stand under my care. I do not post them publicly. Public rules invite amateurs. These are for those who inherit after me if inheritance remains necessary. I write them not as guidance, but as a confession arranged into procedure. Rule 1. Always open the lower door before sunset. If you wait until after dark, it interprets hesitation as resistance. Resistance makes it curious, and curiosity expands the route. Rule 2. Always acknowledge the knock, not because politeness matters, but because silence drives it inland through other channels, pipes, drains, culverts, dreams. A known answer keeps it localized. Yet Rule 3. Only one passenger is allowed per night. One is not humane. One is arithmetic. More than one teaches its scale. The empty teaches its resentment. Rule 4. Never let the ferry leave empty. This is the filthiest rule and the truest. An empty departure does not mean a spared life. It means the selection moves elsewhere beyond the terminal's containment and beyond your witness. Rule 5. Do not lie to yourself about what you are protecting. Not the town, not the passengers, not your family name. You are protecting the shoreline from a worse expression of the same hunger. Moral vanity is how keepers become priests. Rule 6. If the ferry sends someone back, do not ask what they saw. Some return, not often. They come ashore dry, confused, and emptied of a few necessary certainties. Questions fray them. Rule 7. Never board twice in the same month. It begins to learn you too specifically if you do. I have made that mistake. The dreams afterward wore my own face. Most nights the terminal is only a terminal. Rot, paperwork, salt, gulls at dawn. Then there are nights when the water stills and the lights wake, and the old computer prints a single line. Hold for approach. On those nights I stand in the main hall beneath my family's long facade of civic architecture and wait to see who the dark delivers. Sometimes travelers show up already half decided. They have the look of people who have walked too far inside their own lives to go back the same way. I don't force them. I explain as much as can be explained without breaking the structure of choice. There is a ferry. It goes across. I cannot tell you where across is. You may board it, or you may turn around and walk back into the dark. Most choose the ferry. A few don't. A few leave, and sometimes they make it to the road, and sometimes the harbor takes payment elsewhere before dawn. That's part of what the old rules hid. Control is partial, never complete. The terminal does a job. It does not perform miracles. Walter says I've become too calm. Maybe he's right. Measured speech can rot into professionalized horror if you're not careful. But panic is useless here, and guilt, while deserved, is not operational. I feel both. I simply don't indulge either when the bell rings. The town sleeps more easily now than it did during the years the terminal sat closed. Drownings have gone down. Road washouts stopped. The marsh lights don't move inland anymore. North Channel believes the county has finally invested in shoreline reinforcement. People like administrative explanations. They let communities survive their own edges. As for me, I remain where my family meant me to remain, though not in the way they intended. I am a keeper, yes, but not a believer. I do not think the ferry is sacred. I do not think service ennobles necessity. I think a thing found a route through human systems and my blood happened to fit its oldest lock. That is all. Or not all. Nothing stays that simple here. Some nights when the ferry is late and the lower water knocks with unusual insistence, I remember the child in the front row turning to me with my mother's eyes. I remember boarding. I remember dimly that there are shorelines beyond ours now tied to this crossing in ways I do not yet understand, and the threat is learning still. Adaptive things always do, but the water remains calm when the ferry leaves occupied, and calm water means the line is holding. It means the terminal is still doing its job, if that word can survive what the job requires, keeping something far worse from coming ashore. And if one day someone finds this place after I'm gone, another Mercer or some stranger with my keys and my bad luck, I hope they read this before they open the lower door. Though if blood has anything to do with it, the door may already know them, and the knock, when it comes from beneath the water, may sound less like a warning than like home.